A commercial pilot and his fiancée took off on a clear sunny afternoon just one day after he had proposed to her. Unfortunately though, he made a very tragic mistake and they crashed less than 2 minutes after takeoff, killing them both instantly. Now this debrief is going to be a little bit different because I've got a personal connection to all of this that I'm going to share with you when we talk about what really happened on this flight, so be sure to stick around. I'm Hoover and welcome to your pilot debrief. Before we talk about the tragic mistakes that were made on this flight, it's important to take a moment to honor the victims. Rebecca was in the passenger seat and she was only 28 years old. She was a deputy with the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department in California, and one of her goals in life was to help people and have a positive influence on the world. Sitting next to Rebecca was Brian, and he was 30 years old and he was the pilot flying the plane. Brian had a commercial pilot certificate for fixed-wing aircraft with ratings for single and multi-engine, as well as an instrument rating. Now, we don't know exactly when he started flying because his logbook starts off with about 181 hours in it, and his first entry was from August of 2007, which was almost 10 years prior to this tragedy. According to his logbook, he flew a couple times a month from 2007 until 2008, mostly in a Piper PA-28 and a PA-44, where he logged about 36 hours of flight time. Then there's a big gap in his logbook for the next few years, but he did manage to log about 5 flights in a Diamond DA-40 before he eventually joined the Army, and in 2011 he went to flight school at Fort Rucker. That's where he obtained his rotorcraft helicopter rating, and he ended up flying the UH-60 Blackhawk for the Army, and he held the rank of Chief Warrant Officer 2. Now, it's not clear how much flight time Brian had in the UH-60, but the NTSB said that he had about 750 hours of total flight time in all of the aircraft that he had flown. Around 2015, he met Rebecca, and the two of them had somewhat of a storybook relationship. After dating for about 2 years, Brian decided that he would propose, but he wanted to make it special, so he decided to rent an airplane, and his plan was to fly Rebecca out to the Big Bear Airport in Big Bear, California. And to better understand how this trip turned into a tragedy, we need to take a closer look at where he was flying and his plan. First of all, if you're not familiar with Big Bear, it's located about 20 miles directly to the northeast of the San Bernardino Airport, so it's a very short flight. However, Big Bear is in the mountains where the elevation is over 5,000 feet higher than San Bernardino. Additionally, there are 8,000 to 10,000 foot high mountains pretty much all around the area that pilots need to be aware of. Plus, the airport has special noise abatement procedures that pilots have to abide by because of the close proximity of the town and local schools. One of the biggest concerns for operating out of an airport like Big Bear is density altitude. Now, I've talked about this several times on my channel, but to try to simplify it, density altitude is kind of like a measure of how thick the air is, and it's the altitude that your aircraft feels like it's at. The higher you go in altitude, typically the worse your aircraft is going to perform. If you're flying a normally aspirated engine, you're going to lose about 3.5% of horsepower for every 1,000-foot increase in density altitude. Basically, you have less engine power and you have a reduction in your rate of climb, something that's very important to be aware of around the mountains. One of the factors that plays a big role in density altitude is temperature. The hotter it is, the higher the density altitude is going to be. On the day of the crash, the skies were clear, but the temperature was 25 degrees Celsius or about 77 degrees Fahrenheit. That might not seem like it's that warm, but the truth is that even though the field elevation at Big Bear is 6,752 feet, the density altitude at the time of the crash was 9,138 feet, and that's a pretty big change. That being said, when it comes to Brian's plan, he most likely hadn't flown general aviation aircraft in several years because he was busy flying with the Army. Now, it's possible he did some recreational flying occasionally over the years, but if he did, he never recorded it in his logbook. That's why when Brian came up with his plan to fly Rebecca out to Big Bear, he took the time to go get checked out again in a Cessna 172, an aircraft he likely hadn't flown in over 10 years. Now, this is where the story starts to get personal for me because I haven't flown a Cessna 172 in 25 years, and I've been wanting to get back into more general aviation flying, so I recently decided to find a good flight school and an instructor to get checked out again. I'm sure every pilot remembers their first solo flight, and for the majority of pilots, it was in a Cessna 172. It's very easy to fly, but just like all aircraft, you have to treat it with the respect it deserves because a simple mistake can turn deadly. That's why even though I've got a few thousand hours of experience flying fighter jets, I wanted to do this the right way. So I found a highly motivated and knowledgeable CFI to sign me off after a few flights. Now I can't emphasize enough how important this is when you haven't flown an aircraft in a long time, or when you're transitioning to flying a new aircraft, you need to find somebody that's qualified and capable of giving you the instruction and training that you need to be safe. Now, when it comes to Brian, he got checked out again in a Cessna 172 on May 1st, 2017, which was almost 3 months prior to the crash. That flight was conducted out of the Apple Valley Airport, which is located about 30 miles north of San Bernardino. That flight included standard practice maneuvers such as slow flight and steep turns, and because the Apple Valley Airport sits at an elevation of about 3,000 feet, the instructor took the time to review the fuel mixture control leaning procedures, especially because Brian wasn't used to flying reciprocating engines as much as he was turbine engines, which don't require the pilot to manually lean the mixture. According to the investigation, the instructor didn't have anything bad to say about Brian. However, they only did one flight to get him signed off. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm sure that Brian was more than capable of safely taking off and landing the aircraft, and I'm not questioning the CFI at all in this scenario. Rather, I'm thinking about my own experience and how even though I felt comfortable enough to be signed off after my first flight back in a Cessna, it was important to me to knock out a few more flights just to go through the different scenarios, especially because I wanted to take my kids flying, and it's important to me to do everything that I can to be as safe as possible. That's why I think when it comes to Brian, almost all of his experience for the past 10 years had been flying UH-60 helicopters, so it probably would have been good for him to knock out a few more flights in the Cessna with a CFI, especially since he was planning on flying to Big Bear up in the mountains. That being said, about a week after Brian did his one flight checkout, he rented a Cessna 172 and most likely flew it by himself from the Apple Valley Airport up to Big Bear and then back to Apple Valley. Now, my guess is that flight was essentially his trial run flying into Big Bear so he could gain some confidence before taking Rebecca on the trip. Brian would end up flying the Cessna again on July 10th, about 2 weeks before the crash. This time he flew from Apple Valley up to Palo Alto near San Francisco and back, logging just over 8 hours of flight time, and he was probably feeling pretty comfortable operating the Cessna after that trip. And now that you understand a little more about Brian and his background, we need to talk about what happened on the day of the crash. According to the NTSB, Brian and Rebecca arrived at the Big Bear Airport in the Cessna 172 that Brian had rented 1 day prior to the accident. After they got out of the plane, Brian proposed to Rebecca in front of the aircraft, and she said yes. The next day they showed up at the airport, not realizing that this would be their final flight together. The Cessna 172 they were flying in was a 1980 model that had accrued about 54 hours since its most recent 100-hour inspection and about 643 hours since the last engine overhaul. Brian purchased just over 5 gallons of fuel on the day of the accident, and even if he had topped off the fuel tanks, the NTSB determined that the weight and balance of the aircraft were within the limits for the flight. In fact, they were at least 200 pounds below the max gross weight for the aircraft, and it was eventually determined that there was nothing wrong with the aircraft that contributed to the crash. Based on the performance chart calculations, the aircraft was capable of climbing at a rate of 440 feet per minute, which should have been more than sufficient for their departure using runway 08 to the east. Unfortunately, according to eyewitnesses and an airport surveillance camera, as soon as they got airborne, the aircraft became increasingly slow. As it approached the departure end of the runway, it stopped climbing, and one person said that it had a nose-high pitch attitude and seemed to be hanging by the prop. An eyewitness and his wife were on the ground yelling at the plane to lower the nose, but tragically there wasn't anything they could do. They watched in horror as Brian began a 90-degree turn to the downwind leg as the aircraft began to sink and the wings rocked back and forth before it disappeared behind the trees and crashed. The aircraft impacted the ground in a nose-down attitude with all signs pointing to an aerodynamic stall being the cause. Later on in the wreckage, they discovered that the mixture control was in the full rich position, but it's not clear if that was the position it was in leading up to the crash. Either way, based on the surveillance video evidence, the aircraft was initially climbing at a rate of about 340 feet per minute. And the NTSB determined that Brian probably recognized a degraded aircraft performance due to the density altitude, but I'd also argue that he probably noticed a difference because if the last time he flew into Big Bear he was by himself, then the added weight of a passenger would also decrease the climb performance. Regardless, when the aircraft wasn't climbing out as fast as he was used to, instead of lowering the nose to gain or maintain airspeed, he pulled back on the controls to try and increase the rate of climb. It's also possible he might have moved the mixture to full rich, trying to improve the engine performance, not realizing that he was actually making the situation worse. Eventually, the aircraft got too slow and he exceeded the critical angle of attack and stalled. Overall, this was a sad story, and my heart goes out to their friends and family because this was just a case of a very tragic mistake. Even though Brian tried to do the right thing by getting checked out again in a Cessna 172, he only did one flight with an instructor and then 2 more flights over the course of about 3 months leading up to the crash, with only one of those flights being conducted at Big Bear, a high elevation airport. This tragedy has definitely given me something to think about as I start to fly a Cessna again, and I hope you've also been able to learn something from this video. If you did, then be sure to leave a comment below and share your experience, and thanks so much for your support.